Have you ever stared at the night sky and felt a sense of overwhelming smallness? Now, imagine a number so vast it dwarfs the stars, a figure that grows every second of every day. What if I told you that number represents the world's debt, a colossal sum exceeding $300 trillion? It's a debt held by nearly every country on Earth. The United States owes over $36 trillion. China owes nearly $18 trillion. Japan, Germany, the UK, the list goes on. But if every nation is a borrower, it begs a simple yet profound question. Who is the lender? If everyone owes money, who, in the end, owns all this debt? The answer isn't a single entity hiding in the shadows, but a story that stretches back centuries, a journey of trust, innovation, and a delicate balance that holds our modern world together. The United States, often seen as the world's economic powerhouse, carries a staggering debt of around $36 trillion. A significant portion of this, over $7 trillion, is owed to foreign entities. Countries like Japan and China are major creditors, holding vast reserves of U.S. Treasury bonds. This often paints a simple picture. America borrows, and countries like China lend. But this image is a dramatic oversimplification, a single chapter in a much more intricate saga. When we turn our gaze to China, we discover a fascinating paradox. While it acts as a major lender to the U.S., it is also grappling with its own monumental internal debt, estimated to be around $18 trillion. This isn't money owed to other nations, but a debt held primarily within its own borders, by its own state-owned banks and financial institutions. This dual role of creditor and debtor isn't unique to China or the U.S. It's the very fabric of our global financial system. Us banks, in turn, hold debt from European nations, which hold debt from Asian corporations, which might be financed by American investment funds. It's not a straight line from borrower to lender. It's a complex, interwoven web, a dizzying dance of credits and debits crisscrossing the globe. This intricate network, where everyone seems to owe everyone else, culminates in that astronomical figure of over $300 trillion in total global debt. It's a system born not of a single grand design, but through a long, organic evolution of human trust and ingenuity. The story of this debt is, in essence, the story of how we learned to promise, and how those promises built the world we know today. Long before the gleaming screens of Wall Street, before stocks and bonds, debt began with a simple, human act of trust. Imagine a farmer thousands of years ago whose harvest failed. His neighbor, with a surplus of grain, lends him enough to survive the winter, on the promise that he will be repaid, perhaps with a little extra, after the next harvest. There were no complex contracts, no lawyers, no international courts. There was only a promise, a bond between two people. This fundamental concept, lending today in exchange for a promise of repayment. Tomorrow is the seed from which all modern finance has grown. For centuries, debt remained a largely private affair. But as societies grew and kingdoms expanded, rulers needed a way to fund their ambitions, their wars, their palaces, their explorations without constantly raising unpopular taxes. This challenge sparked a revolutionary idea. In the 17th century, governments began to innovate. Instead of forcing a loan from a wealthy noble or demanding more from the peasantry, they started selling their debt to the public. They issued what we now call bonds. A bond was, and still is, a radical concept. It's a tiny, sellable fraction of a government's promise. By buying a bond, you weren't just lending money. You were buying a piece of the nation's future commitment. This invention was transformative. It allowed governments to raise vast sums of capital, funding everything from the British Empire's naval fleet to America's nascent infrastructure. It democratized lending, allowing ordinary citizens, merchants, and foreign investors to have a stake in a nation's success. The simple, personal promise of the farmer had evolved into a sophisticated, tradable instrument of sovereign power, setting the stage for an explosion in global credit. For a long time, this growing mountain of debt was anchored to something tangible: gold. Under the gold standard, a country's currency had a fixed value in gold, meaning you could, in theory, exchange your paper money for a specific amount of the precious metal. This placed a natural limit on how much money a government could print, and consequently, how much debt it could create. You couldn't just invent money out of thin air. It had to be backed by the gold in your vaults. But in 1971, the world changed forever. The United States, under President Nixon, made a monumental decision. It severed the dollar's final link to gold. This act untethered the world's leading currency from any physical constraint, giving birth to the age of fiat money currency whose value is based on nothing more than government decree and public trust. This liberation from gold opened the floodgates for debt creation on an unprecedented scale. Without a physical anchor, the amount of money a country could print, and therefore borrow, became theoretically limitless. This brings us to a startling and often misunderstood truth about America's massive debt. While we hear about the billions owed to China and Japan, the surprising reality is that the largest owner of U.S. debt is the United States itself. Roughly 70% of all public U.S. debt is held domestically. It's owned by the very institutions that form the backbone of American life. The Social Security Trust Fund, pension funds, managing your retirement, insurance companies, mutual funds, and commercial banks. In a very real sense, the U.S. government is borrowing from its own people and its own future. When you pay into your pension, a portion of that money is likely used to buy a U.S. Treasury bond, making you, indirectly, a creditor to your own government. So how does a country manage a debt that it seemingly never intends to fully repay? The secret lies in a mechanism that feels almost like a magic trick: rolling over the debt. When a government bond matures, meaning the time has come to pay back the principal to the lender, the government rarely uses tax revenue to pay it off. Instead, it simply issues new bonds and uses the money from those new sales to pay back the holders of the maturing bonds. It's like paying off one credit card with a new one. This cycle can continue indefinitely. As long as one crucial condition is met, people must continue to trust the government and be willing to buy the new bonds. This entire system is a delicate dance built on faith. The sustainability of this dance depends on several factors. If a country's economy grows faster than its debt, the debt burden, as a percentage of GDP, actually shrinks over time, making it more manageable. High inflation can also erode the real value of the debt, making it easier to pay back in the future with less valuable money. But the linchpin holding it all together is trust. If investors, both domestic and foreign, were to suddenly lose faith in a government's ability or willingness to honor its promises, they would stop buying its bonds. The music would stop. The government would be unable to roll over its debt, leading to a default. A catastrophic event that could shatter not just one nation's economy, but the entire global financial system. This trust is the invisible force that allows the cycle of debt to continue. In this global theater of debt, the United States holds a unique and powerful position, often described as an exorbitant privilege. Because the U.S. dollar is the world's primary reserve currency, the main currency used for international trade and held by central banks worldwide, the U.S. has an incredible advantage. It can borrow in its own currency. When Brazil or Turkey needs to borrow, they often have to do so in dollars, exposing them to currency risk. If their own currency weakens, their dollar-denominated debt becomes much harder to repay. The United States faces no such problem. It borrows in dollars, a currency it can, in the age of fiat money, literally print more of. This ability to create the very currency it owes gives the U.S. a nearly limitless borrowing capacity and keeps its borrowing costs lower than those of almost any other nation. This reveals the true nature of the global debt system. It isn't a simple, linear relationship where one country is the borrower and another is the lender. It's a vast, cyclical network. Your savings in a bank account don't just sit in a vault. The bank lends that money out to businesses, individuals, or even buys government bonds. That money flows through the economy, eventually finding its way to other savers, investors, and governments, who in turn repeat the process. Money is constantly flowing in a circular motion from those who save to those who invest and spend. With governments acting as major intermediaries in this global circulatory system, the U.S. dollar, as the world's reserve currency, acts as the lifeblood of this system, and the exorbitant privilege of printing it gives the U.S. a powerful role at its very heart. However, this incredible power is not a divine right. It is a privilege built entirely on a foundation of trust. The world holds dollars and U.S. bonds because it believes in the stability of the U.S. economy and the commitment of its government to honor its debts. If that trust were ever to falter, perhaps due to political instability, runaway inflation, or a perception that the debt is becoming unmanageable, the consequences would be dire. If global investors began to doubt the value of the dollar or the safety of U.S. bonds, they would demand higher interest rates to compensate for the perceived risk. Borrowing costs for the U.S. government would skyrocket, making it vastly more expensive to roll over its debt. This could trigger a vicious cycle. Higher interest payments would lead to more borrowing, which could further erode trust, pushing interest rates even higher. The exorbitant privilege would evaporate. And the system that has defined the global economy for decades could face a crisis of confidence. It's threatening to unravel the intricate web that binds us all. The story of debt is not over. We are living in its most ambitious and precarious chapter yet,